today's lecture we are going to talk about plyometrics mainly, okay, power training, which it is also called. Now, power training in this lecture, due to the scope of the whole time limit, we will be mainly looking at bodyweight exercises, okay. And why bodyweight exercises? Because they are the most easiest to incorporate into a training program. So now when we say bodyweight training, okay, and bodyweight power moves, if we take into account a sport, now let's take an explosive sport into account, and I'll take again something which is very popular in India, which is badminton, okay. Cricket might be more popular, but of course compared to badminton, the physical requirements are not as much. So when we look at now badminton, if you see a shot which is done like when they jump into the air, hit a smash, land and quickly move to the net, they might play a dribble, or they might rush into the net and hit a tap and then go back again. So we'll learn these moves so that we can then incorporate them. These are basic moves, but the basics are what you have to master, okay. So now coming to plyometrics, okay. Plyometrics, nothing but fast movements, right? There are basically two types in this. One you could call it the dampened plyometrics, D-A-M-P-E-N-E-D, dampened plyometrics. The other one is undampened. Now if we divide these, what is the main difference? Dampened plyometrics, we are mainly talking about base level plyometrics, where you let the shock be absorbed before the next movement, okay. So whom is this for? This is for rank beginners, somebody who's starting off. This is also for young kids, okay, youngsters whose joints you need to be a bit more cautious of loading, okay. Plyometrics, as effective as it is also that part of training where the most injuries happen. The most amount of knees go bust because of plyometrics. And I won't say it's because of plyometrics, it's because of inappropriate plyometrics that due to maybe our lack of knowledge or due to over enthusiasm we end up giving. So when we talk of plyometrics, like I said, there's the dampened and undampened. So straight away, let's get into the dampened part, okay. Now dampened plyometrics, sometimes that position is also what's called the athletic position, where you land and after you're landing or if you're stopping, you get into this position of knees flexed, elbows flexed, everything, and you're ready, okay. So you see a lot of movements where people do and they get into this. Getting into the movement is not too important, okay. What you do before the movement is more important. What's even more important is how many times are you repeating that movement. That's what's more important. A lot of strength coaches get very involved and sort of, very obsessed with this whole thing of getting into that athletic position. You throw a medicine ball and then they're ready, okay. I mean, get that ready position is not how you're going to stand ready in every sport, okay. But what are you doing for your legs or for your upper body is what matters. So now getting to basics of plyometrics, okay. Dampened plyometrics and undampened. So dampened will show what is done. Dampened is nothing but a jump where you jump and land into a position which is of a ready position and you stop that movement. So Varun will be just doing it. So Varun, if you could just show just a stationary one where you jump and in the same spot you land. Perfect. Once again. Good. So as you can see, he jumps and after landing, he stops the movement, okay. So what is happening here is that when he lands, we are teaching that muscles to absorb that impact which is created, okay, rather than from there jump again, because his ligaments, his tendons are probably, let's assume he's a rank beginner, he's not ready for it. So we teach this first, okay, just stationary jumps. So if you have a team of youngsters working in badminton, working in various sports, first thing to teach them is to land proper. If you can land properly, then you teach to jump proper, okay. So this is nothing but landing, okay. You stand. If this is also hard for some people, you just make sure that they land and they land into a jump which is not too high. So if you can just get into a ready position without jumping too high, just get the feet off the floor and then just there, a short one, there. So even this is good for somebody who's not used to. Again, once more, we'll do it 5 times. Again, and once more. Good. Okay, so that's 5 times. Now that's a decent amount of load if he had to do that 10 times or 20 of these. That's pretty decent for somebody who starts. Okay. Now one thing here in this, before we get to any further movements, is let's talk about what's wrong. Okay, as you can see, when he's doing it the correct way, he's landing proper, his knees are tracking over his toes. Okay, what happens when sometimes, especially young kids, when they do, they end up jumping and this is what happens, right? Knees are going in. The tracking of the knee is not really in line with the whole bone structure. It's here. Okay, this is what you want, but many people do this. Some people would do this. Some might even go and do this. Okay, what do you do then? Move them back to endurance work. Very simple logic. Many people make this mistake. Coaches, strength coaches sometimes get obsessed with this jump training because it's so effective. It's effective, it's done right. If it's not done right, it's actually one of the worst things you could do for your knees, especially young adolescents, who are growing and whose strength is not there, and you're just trying to teach. So plyometrics are only for those who are strong. Let's keep that understanding. Okay. So like we've done now with correct technique, you've seen how he's jumped, he's landed in the same spot. Okay. Now what we can do as a progression, let's say you have a player and now they can do around maybe 3 sets of 20, okay, of this. That is when you move to the next progression. Many people think that, but this is so simple, all right? This is not so impressive to look at. You're maybe having a class and there's parents sitting there, other students, you want to do something impressive. You want to choose effective over impressive. It's been told in the lectures, right? So make sure it's effective. So for somebody who's rank beginner, just these jumps, done 20 times, jump, hold, stand, jump, hold, stand. Let them get into landing correctly. Over time, when this gets easy, maybe let them land, jump a bit higher and land. So if you can just now do a bit higher jump and land into it. Okay. So it's more of a maximal jump again. Good. Now as you can see, this becomes something where now the progression is more. He's jumping higher, much more impact. Let that take time. Let that person master. Can you just do a jump smash action where you jump, hit a smash and land, just so that people get how this would transfer to badminton. Okay. Again and now once more. So this is a smash action. Now a jump smash and tap. Let's assume the net is just here. Okay. Once again, max jump, smash, tap. Okay. So as you can see in a sport like badminton, how the jump has to then also transfer and get involved in a different plane of motion. So now how do we progress? Let's assume now this person has been able to jump, land and is able to do 23 times. What do? Now you move to the next progression. In that, what you do is simple. You first stick with a sagittal plane movement, which is front and back, front and back. Okay. So what he'll be doing is he'll be landing forward, not too far, maybe from here, just a foot forward and then back, foot forward and back. Let's try that now. And then he stands. Now what you could do is, now he's done the undampened version, and because it's very tempting, somebody who's strong is able to do. But if it's a small kid, you then start doing it still with movement but with stops. So again, start, stop, start back. Okay, again, okay, once again, once more. Good. Okay. So then they master this. Then let them do 3 sets of 20 here, break maybe for a minute and a half, 2 minutes, then again and once more. Now when they master this, then you move to the frontal plane. Okay, so this was sagittal, right? It's front and back. Now we do side to side. Badminton has a lot of lateral movements. We take tennis, even tennis, table tennis as well. Majority of sports they have. So you progress to lateral only when you've mastered the front. Okay, give it time. There's no rush. Okay, this is something, like I've said, a high risk move if done wrong. Give it time. Now let's do side to side. Same, you jump and you stop. Now jump and you stop. Now jump and you stop. Again jump and you stop. Okay, right, good. So now this is for most beginners, starting from stationary, then they've started going front back, now side to side. Now which is the next plane, which is the hardest to master, the transverse plane, going round and round. Okay. So here, for somebody who's maybe a beginner, it can be a 90-degree turn. Now you move instead of side, same spot, but you jump and you land 90 degrees this way. Okay. Then you land back at 90 degrees. Okay, and then we'll show the next progression. So if you can just do that. Good. Again there. Again. Super. Now this is a 90-degree turn. Now we can make it slightly harder, even more. What do? You make it 180 degrees. So if it's facing there, he ends here, then he jumps again, lands there. Can you just do that? Yeah. So it's a full 180-degree turn. He stops, then goes again. Good. Yeah, as much as you can. So completely if you can turn here. There you go. Yes, good. Once again. Perfect. Good. So as you can see in these jumps now, as he turns, okay, these become much more sport specific because of the fact that even when he hits a smash, the hip turns, he moves forward, finishes with the tap. Okay. So even a movement like this, which is rotational, okay, needs to be done with progression. So what are the progressions? One is we had a smaller angle, then we went to a greater angle of 180 degrees. Okay. Now these three progressions that we've done, okay, where we've done the rotational, we've done the sagittal first, sagittal, frontal, and then rotational. Okay. How do we make this slightly harder? We increase the distance. Okay. So now what he did first jump will sort of make it harder than that. Same thing, you'll jump but a greater distance. Okay. So maybe from here to approx here, not too far, just one jump. And there you go, nice. Then back. Good. Good. And then back. Once again. Once more. Good. So you can see how sort of this now becomes a bit harder when you jump forward, right? It's much more distance to be covered, so more power required to produce. Now let's do the same with side to side. So it becomes a bit harder now. Good. Cool. Now he'll be doing 180 degrees. So in 180, there are two ways he can make it. One is distance, second is height. Okay, and both, even in the frontal plane as well, he could jump further, he could also jump higher. The further he jumps, the more power he has to produce. The higher he jumps, the more impact he has to absorb. Okay, so you can just do the rotational one now. Okay, I would want you to maybe do it where you do a 90 but with more distance. Okay, so you'll start from there and you'll end somewhere over here. Okay, so comfortably. Superb. Then the other side. Once again. Excellent. Okay. So now you can see what we've done. We've covered distance as well. We've changed the plane of motion as well. Okay. Now, if he's going to want to maybe take advantage, you want to still put one more grading in between. You make him do 180 but with greater height. Okay. So we'll try it this time where you jump higher, same place you rotate and land in 180. Okay. Jump high, super, good. And again, jump high, one more. So you can see how he does and how the quads have to decelerate. Okay, stop. Good. So you can see all these basic moves, but how the gradations are, how the variations are. Clever strength and conditioning coaches will know exactly how to place these. It's like a medicine. You know the basic medicine, and then you know how to increase the dose. And you have something at your disposal to increase, rather than just making somebody, jump and call it jump training or plyometric training. So plyometric training, just like any training, you have to earn the right to do plyometric training. Plyometric training is not for every person. Okay. Now, in this variations now that you've seen, what can be the progression now beyond this for somebody who is beginner, who's now done this, can do 20 jumps, 3 sets. Okay. So now one which can happen, okay, is undampened. Okay. Now undampened is where you don't stop between reps. Same thing, but each jump you finish, you go on, you bounce. You can also call it to an extent sort of, continuous plyometrics, or you can call it bounce training, whatever. There are various terms people use, but we are using now what's called undampened. You don't dampen the shock. You go and boom, you bounce and bounce and bounce and bounce. So now we'll show that, okay, how that could be done. So we'll start again with the basics. So from here, once somebody has mastered these, how do we move to that next one? You start with the first one, which is stationary. You don't change spots, okay, just stationary. So stationary, he'll do around 5 of these, okay, just vertical and constant. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you could work up to 20. Works amazing for most sports which require that quickness. Okay, you just learn to be quick, and the way the body sort of over time adapts, the whole stretch reflex action that happens inside, you will slowly become better at that bounciness on courts. Okay, very simple move, but has to be done right. You have to grow to it. Now, maybe if you work with badminton players, because the sport itself is so full of plyometric movement. The sport itself is plyometric. So for them, maybe if there's a person who's maybe an advanced level athlete, probably 14 years old or so, they might be able to move to this. Okay, so a badminton player who's competitive might find this still doable when they start off and quickly progress in a week's time. But you have to be careful of those people who come maybe for these what do you call them, the summer camps, people who come for batches, kids who have no experience of training. And then you see a coach who just puts some ladders or something and just makes them do these jumps. And then some of them jump, and it's a nightmare to watch, when youngsters jump and they just jump in the end, go like that. I mean, I don't even want to do that, but because it's just so impact, but that's how they jump, or they'll just jump like this. One of the first things to remember, every jump, you have to jump like a cat. Okay, you have to absorb that shock. A cat, when it lands, okay, you'll notice there's no sound. And the reason is, I always give this example, because the cat has paws, and that's the reason why it is so explosive. Okay, you don't want to jump like a deer or like cattle. Now, when a deer or cattle jump, if you notice, they don't have that same control of a cat if a cat has to drop from an X height. The reason is because the cat has paws, the deer has hooves. Okay. Now the deer or the horse or the cow can afford to still make that sound and move, okay, because they have hooves. Unless you have hooves on your feet, okay, jump without making a sound. Okay, so don't make sounds. Absorb the shock, nice and easy, move to the next. Absorb the shock, nice and easy, move to the next. It's all about absorption of the shock. A person who has good power knows to produce power and also knows to absorb that impact which comes from that power. Okay, so somebody who jumps from a height and is able to land and absorb and then quickly transfer, that's ultimately what we want. And that is where the depth jump comes in, and some very effective movements come in. But again, like I said, to progress in plyometrics, you have to earn the right and you have to take your time. So that's why we're just touching on basics. This is not a full-on strength and conditioning course. This is a course to make you better so that you understand the basics. Okay, so we won't be going to too many high-level plyometric training movements, but just basics. Master the basics. Basics are sufficient for majority of athletes. I've worked with so many international athletes. For majority of them, it is good enough. This, the very high level things that you see maybe on social media, people doing some very fancy moves. Majority athletes wouldn't do that. We are looking at what works for athletes safely and sound. Okay. So we've now seen him do the stationary jumps with an undampened effect, right? Where he doesn't stop down, it's just jump, move, jump, move, jump, move. Now, what's next that we do? Okay, same thing done where he does now it in a sagittal plane movement. So he'll jump front, back, but all this done without stopping. Okay, so it's just that bounce, bounce, bounce. Let's check that. Okay, so if you can do that, Varun, maybe 6 jumps. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. So assuming we do 20 jumps like this. Now how do we make it harder? One is to jump further, but one of the drawbacks of jumping too far forward is balance. If you really go far, to get back quickly becomes much harder. So instead here it can be the same distance but more vertical height now. Okay, so let's try maybe 4 or 5, okay, with greater height. With least sound, yep, least sound, explode, super, stop. So that becomes the progression, just make them jump higher. Okay, what's the next progression now? Okay, from frontal we move to lateral. Okay, so same thing without stops. Okay, you can try. Two, 3, 4, 5, 6, super. Now this is so effective, and this is one of the very simple drills which can help in so many sports. One is that he's jumping here. Which side is the momentum? It's towards the right. What happens when he lands? He's decelerating, he's bracing, he's stabilizing, then he changes direction. So think of it, you know, he generates power to come here. Once he lands, his whole body is moving here. His bracing moves. Again, this is what's required in so many sports. Football, tennis, basketball, where there's that constant lateral movement. And lateral movement is really what kind of separates most top athletes to the others. Many athletes are okay to move in a sagittal plane front and back. This movement is what is the real sort of deal maker. Okay, simple move can be messed up by just doing unnecessary complexities. So simple, side to side, side to side, side to side. Okay, 20 if you can do, there's enough plyometric ability as well. At the same time, there's enough lactic acid buildup as well. So those who are into playing badminton, long rallies, this can work like magic. Okay, it has lactate production, it has the plyometric effect as well. It will work your lungs as well. Okay, so simple move. Now how do we make this harder? We can possibly ask him to jump higher, or we can maybe, you know, keep an object in between, okay, where he focuses on. So now the next progression in this, okay, we will talk about is adding a jump. You can either ask the person to jump themselves, or you can put something tiny, you know, something maybe just as high as their ankles here, okay, just above the ankle. Not too high, because one of the problems that happens with something too high, I'll explain later. So we can put this, he'll just jump over the ball laterally and then just jump over the ball again. Okay, so let's go on. Stop. Good. So this becomes the next progression. Now one might say, okay, can we not make it even higher? And you see this often, the mistake that is made many times in badminton. Okay, you see coaches, strength coaches, put maybe a shuttle box. Okay, the shuttle box is at least this high. Okay, so what happens when people jump over it? I'll show you. Just stay there. So we'll now be using this, okay, as just an example of what not to do. Okay, which is a very common thing you see in badminton, or sometimes when cones are used which are very high. Okay, now this is almost as high as Varun's knees. So it would look very impressive if you can jump over this, right, side to side. So let's try jumping, and let's just see the movement as it happens. So if you can just show Varun what happens here. Good. So as you can see, his hip travels just about from here to here. The thing that makes more travel is his knee joint, where the angle of the knee flexion goes so much more that when he lands here, it's not really his hip going high, nor is it his ankles really going up in the air. His ankles, yes, they are going up in the air, but by virtue of bending at the knee. So movements like this don't really make much sense. You end up doing it, sort of looks great that you have something which is so high, and people think that, oh, there's a whole class doing it together. Side jumps. Okay, does it make sense is what you have to ask. Now, if maybe a technical coach does this, they might do it out of not knowing. They might do it out of over enthusiasm. As a strength and conditioning coach, if you are going to do this, then you really have to ask yourself, like, what is your progression? What is your answer for choosing this? What are the 3 points, if I had to ask, to choose a shuttle box and to jump this high? What are the 3 reasons why you've chosen this? So you have to have answers, like I've always said. Okay. So we've now done the lateral. Now we'll be looking at doing the transverse one, okay, where he jumps in the air and does a movement. So what you'll be doing now is you'll be jumping in the air, obviously doing non-stop. Okay, so let's try that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, stop. So around 20 of these at 90-degree angle. Okay. Now what's the next progression? 180 degrees. So he starts facing here, goes all the way around and turns. Okay, you can try. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Super. Now this would help, especially people when they are playing sports where something like table tennis, you play a short, turn quick, play a short, turn quick. Okay, it would help in many sports, where you have to constantly change. Even maybe boxing, where you move, constantly rotate. Okay, many sports require this. So this rotation now, how can we make it harder? Jump higher. Now he can jump. I wouldn't put a medicine ball there because of the risk of, because he's flying in flight, you don't want him to land even by mistake on a medicine ball. And these are those gym mishaps, mishaps that we are talking about. When somebody jumps, ends up jumping, landing just because I wanted to do a fancy drill, ends up landing on the ball, next thing they fall and hit their head or something. Okay, so don't use things when sort of a person is not able to view where they are going. If somebody is working on, say, keeping a medicine ball and doing lateral, it is okay because you can see where that is and he has an awareness. But if the ball is here and is not able to see, don't take a chance. Okay, so we'll be doing stationary now to make it harder, 180 degrees. Okay, and in 180 now with maximum height. So you really make effort to jump up. Okay, superb. 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. Nice. So you could see how high his hip was traveling. Okay, so generally in plyometrics, as you progress, just check the hips. The higher the hips go, you are progressing. Okay, you don't want to do something which is just staying where the hips are down and you're using ankles or ankle movements. All right. Now coming to progressions. Now beyond this, how do we progress? How do we make this harder for him? Let's say there's a person who can now do all this. Pretty good. Landing is good. Now the next progression can be where you wear a weight jacket. Now weight jacket can be pretty effective, a bit cumbersome to do because you have to wear it, you have to keep it, it takes more space. So that is one thing. Another progression is to keep dumbbells in your hands. Okay. Now if you can, Varun, get me 2 dumbbells, 2 kilo dumbbells. Oh, they're there. Just get the blue ones. Yes. So now here we are with these dumbbells. So you can do the same jumps now with dumbbells, almost all of those jumps. Okay, but just watch when he does, if there's anything you would like to note. So you could probably do the side to side. Okay. Okay, relax. Okay. Can you do 90 degrees, the rotational ones? Stop. Yeah. So now for progression, dumbbells work fine. But what is one drawback? His arms are in a flexed position, and I mean for a long time he'd be holding those dumbbells, right? do you want to load it with that, with impact? You want to take that chance with a 12-year-old or 14-year-old? This becomes a bit of a tricky thing. What also happens, now if he doesn't want to keep it here and if he wants to do it sideways, just do a sideways lateral by keeping it to the side. Stop, yeah. So this can be done, but still there is not the most smoothest action that you would want. You would want to use your arms. In any jump, your arms play a role, right? You get in from down and you jump, you want to do this, okay? But dumbbells don't allow you that, okay? They do help only mainly in stationary ones for a progression. If you do it in the same spot, it becomes still sort of okay. Cool, so if you can just do stationary ones to show by keeping your arms to your side. 3, 4, stop. You keep the dumbbells down. Now one immediate effect, and this can sometimes be a trick, you can try this before competitions, one sort of tip. Just jump now, okay, without. Stop. Now if you jump, can you see the difference you get after doing this, okay? And now if you had to even just try a jump smash, okay, just see how high you go, full on. Once again. Okay, cool. So this can be a trick because his mind is registering the weight. So you take this off and sort of, make him do jumps without. That can also have an impact. You need to try this and check, okay, how much it works for which athlete. But this can be something you can use as a trick to sort of get that impact training done and to benefit in playing. It can also be done in swimming. We want to start because of swimming, just if you can get 1 inch extra, that could probably be the difference between a gold and silver, or maybe the difference between you cutting down your time by half a second or 1 second. Okay. Now, we've seen the differences what we can do, right? You can use weights. What would happen if he had a bodyweight jacket, okay, weighted jacket? Only difference is he can still use his arms as they are. Okay. What happens is when he's standing and when he's holding weights, okay, is that the weights are an external part of his body. Okay. It's sort of we are using the appendages, his arms to hold a weight which is hanging and it's all over the place. A bodyweight jacket would be part of his body. It's the core. It's almost like as if he had to be heavier by 5 kilos, okay, if he had to have that amount of weight, or if he had to sort of be as heavy, whatever weight that one can tie to the body, okay, if he sort of, ends up putting that much weight, that is the weight that is moving. So it's like a heavy person moving and then suddenly he becomes light and is so light on the courts, okay, or so light in his sport. So that's why if somebody is using bodyweight jackets, makes the most sense, okay, to be doing this as a progression. You can do it with jumps, but you have to be very careful. Okay. Now, what is the next progression? Like for ultimate athletes, you have somebody who's strong, they can squat well, they have good deadlifts, they can do your power cleans, they can do everything, and now you want them to really have that sort of explosion to be the ultimate athlete as fast as they can be. And sometimes you have, your sprinters do this, okay, where they do their jumps where there's least knee flexion. Okay, you want to just do knee flexion at its least point, but you want to produce the most power. Okay, so we'll do these. Make a note that these are the highest loading exercises, most productive, most damaging if load is applied not correctly. Okay, so the difference now will be he'll be doing the same jump. Only thing is it is more with just knee flexion. He is not going to take his hip down. It is more just trying to stay as vertical only with his knee. So this is the action that he wants, and he wants to powerfully push off his toes so that in the air he's got his toes down as much as possible. Okay, let's try. You can keep your hands to your side if you want. Yeah, and just using your knees as high and higher, higher. Now go max as same spot. Check his knees, keep doing. Just check his knees as he lands. There's not much movement, and stop. Now this is a lot on the knees, okay, but then that's where the power comes from. If you can master this, you have that thing to use this for so many sports, to move quickly, okay, in a short span of time without bending your knees too much. You can move quick. Okay, this can help you in kicks, whether you're doing a martial arts kick. This can help you in moving fast on the track, because you are able to now produce power in a shorter distance. Earlier, all the jumps we've done is his hip traveled down and up. So there was a lot of contribution from the hip, there was contribution from the knee, and contribution from the ankle. In this, we've almost taken the hip out. So a big powerful muscle area, a big powerful joint, we have sort of taken that out. So it's just knee which bends and goes. So imagine if there's somebody, if let's say there's a boxer or a karateka who's in a fight, what do? They stand here and they want to cover distance. Okay. So when they want to cover distance, are they going to do this and move? Does the hip go down? They'd be faster, they'd have a lot more distance, but that's not what you want. You want in sport to produce a lot more distance and also speed without doing too much of eccentric loading, without going here and up. Okay. So if I had to cover distance, I would want my knees to produce minimum distance and go. Okay. So from here, I would want to cover that distance without doing, you can see the distance. This is what I'm doing now, 1 and 2. This is for someone who is not having strength. But if someone has strength, they would want to move from here quick in one go. Okay, so without bending and flexing too much, just there. Okay, this would apply to whether it's a badminton shot, where you want to jump in the air from here. You don't want to go down and up. You just wait and you're able to go up quick. So this is for those people. Extremely tough, not to be done for everybody. This is only for real advanced people. Does this look very impressive? Of course it looks impressive. You can make nice videos with all these movements. This can also break people. Okay, so you have to be very careful while doing these moves, making sure you don't unnecessarily load just because it looks good. You can do some moves where you combine the planes of motion. Okay, it won't be that effective, but it can sometimes just be a change. So it can be something where a person sort of from here goes front to back, comes back, does side, then rotates. Okay, I wouldn't really suggest much of that, simply because then you're not mastering any one plane. Any movement, what do you want to do? You want to master one plane. Okay, your contractions are happening in the legs, so that's good. You then want to learn maybe to move laterally. So lateral, 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 lateral. This is what you probably want. Now, if you're changing it from lateral, you've moved on to sagittal. What are the benefits you're getting? Okay, not really much. And this generally happens, you will notice a lot of times, this is something where benefits are lost in exercises. When you have this whole array of exercises, where people do a whole circuit, it's called circuit training, right? And what is done? You'll do 2 push-ups, jumps, you run to something, you do maybe 5 curls, you jump to something, you do something else. Okay, so that you have these 10 circuits which are kept. A lot of coaches would do this, a lot of strength trainers would sometimes do this. What's really the benefit of that? By mixing up so many things, you don't neither get the benefits of doing push-ups, nor are you getting the benefits of doing squats. Ultimately, what do you get? You get a tired athlete who's trained and is tired and fatigued. Which quality have they built? Have they built the quality of muscle endurance? Have they built the quality of endurance in the pectorals? No. If they are doing a plank in that, what is it they are trying? They are doing everything sub-maximal for a very short time and they keep moving. Okay, that is what happens in sport anyways. If there's a badminton player just doesn't hit smashes, hits a smash, moves to the net, plays a dribble, tries to finish the shot. A tennis player does a serve, next shot, he's not serving again. So what are we doing when people want to improve in the gym? We want to be able to do a movement repeatedly, so that person can have the stamina to do 3 services or 5 services at one time. Okay, when they have that much sort of strength, then they are able to play in the sport where they toss, hit a good serve, and then move and play other shots which are sub-maximal. So now, as I was saying, okay, when we talk about movements which are done, it's all sub-maximal movements, but lots of this doesn't make sense. So same goes with plyos. Stick to one, master one, move to the next progression. Okay. Now we've done plyos. Now what are the other progressions that can be done? Something which again is very effective, but again for very extremely advanced people, is single leg movements. All these moves which is done, he can also do the single leg, but that will take literally double the load. It is straight double the load, because instead of 2 legs now, he lands on 1 leg. So we'll just do some basics, because of course we don't want to take a chance and do unnecessary moves. If you can just do the dampened one, where you jump with double leg and land in single. Okay, so it's 2 to 1. He starts with 2, lands in 1. Same spot. Good. Then again, and hold for a while. Same leg. Good. Perfect. As you can see, he's doing this. Okay, he's landing, holding, right? I made him do the same leg, because what would happen if he does 1 right and 1 left? By the time his right is done and then the left is done, the load is shifting. There's more recovery. I mean, are we doing this to recover? Do I just want him to get tired? No. So you want to do same leg, you kind of keep loading, keep loading, keep loading. When that leg is tired, now you move to the next. So you have some grading, okay, that we worked on the right leg, then we work on the left leg, okay. So single leg becomes 1. Now in single leg, by now you should know that if I have to make him do single leg undampened, it is pretty hard, okay. Single leg, the most advanced version where it's only knee flexion, that becomes even harder, but we'll still try. Let's give it a shot just so that you can know. So he's done the dampened one. Now let's try you go doing single leg, okay, you jump and you just do maybe front back will be pretty hard. So you go 1, 2 and 3 just till here. Okay, so he'll jump 3 without stopping. Okay, just single, same leg. 1 and 2 and 3, stop. Good. So now we've moved on to something where he's done single leg. Now I've not made him to go back, because that amount of loading to take on the knee joint to go forward, okay, and your whole knee tracks. From here your knee tracks, and then if you had to decelerate and change direction, it's quite a bit, okay, and it becomes pretty loaded, and especially if it's somebody who's maybe young, you know, if it was an athlete who's young. So you can move on to this, okay, single leg. Then single leg rotational, okay, great move, but again you have to realize when you're turning, okay, from here, just imagine, and this again very important to understand at advanced level plyos, how to be careful. If I had to, let's assume for argument's sake, if I jump, I'm not going to jump, but from here, I jump in the air, produce power and I land, okay, on that same leg, forget this leg, let's say I land here. What is the motion that I'm going through? Okay, I'm going in this direction, the whole motion is through transverse plane, powerful, so I'm exploding, I'm landing, okay. How does the ACL travel, right? Pocket, hand, okay, that's the way the ACL is. You land here, turning, what is still happening? My momentum is still, my femur is still going this direction, okay, it's still going here. What's holding it back as I'm turning, okay? Think of the ligaments inside, as it's going, ultimately my core, everything's working, but still at the knee joint, you're going in this direction, then you have to stop. So when you jump with that height, you land with impact, you're rotating, okay, and trying to stop. Then you're changing direction, again landing, trying to stop. Football injuries, when we check, what happens? You plant your foot, they try to turn out, okay, or they try to turn this side. Those injuries are common. So in jumps, we sort of end up giving those same types of loads to those ligaments and those structures if you try too many intense things, okay. So single leg rotational, I would say be extremely careful, okay. Now here I would like to make a note, and especially important for those who are into gym training, regular trainers. A lot of times, you know, if somebody new comes in, joins the gym, we end up putting them on a routine where maybe, you know, you put some boxes and you make some, maybe probably is a banker or a teacher, a regular person, maybe 45 years old, has never trained, okay, has just joined the gym. So what do you do as a personal trainer? You think like, oh, let me just show you some good exercises which are hard. Sometimes we are excited to show exercises which are different to everybody else. Because why? If I'm his personal trainer, if I'm going to show him exercises, if I just tell him to do squats, it's like, oh, he's just doing squats, too easy. He's just doing maybe a wall sit, too easy. So what do? I'll say, no, I'm going to show you, sir, something different. Okay, so what do? I'll put that ball there. Okay, and I'm going to make him jump. Okay, and then if he has no practice, he's somebody who's deconditioned, somebody who has work in the office, doesn't eat proper meals, no recovery, maybe has never played sport, or even if he's played sport, at a certain age, that guy, I'm just teaching his knees to get messed up because I'm not going through the stability, endurance, strength and power phase. Okay, and this is a universal thing. You will notice endurance, strength, power, this is done universally. Now there might be some sort of changes that can be done over there, a bit here and there, but still the standard across the world, you will notice most strength and conditioning coaches will follow these with some variations here and there. But nobody will tell you to just try a plyometric jump right the first day, especially for a deconditioned general population. Okay, so you have to be careful if you're a personal trainer incorporating jumps in your training on somebody. Maybe it could be a housewife, maybe it could be somebody who's working, who's a pregnant lady who's got maybe kids. Maybe it could be a youngster who's probably just deconditioned. Are they ready for this? So all this now what we've gone through and you've seen the progressions, you have to then think how does it fit into the average person. Most average people cannot get to this at least without good endurance and strength. So any form of jump training, if it's done, any form of plyometrics, you really have to know how much to do. Okay. Now in this a variation, you might say, okay, how do we do this for the core? So we'll move now to just a core, a very simple variation where a lot of times you see people in a sit-up position and they do sort of with a ball. So again, we'll show a very base level plyometric exercise for the core. Quite a lot of, I would say, load, but we have to show just so that you get an idea. You can get into a sit-up position here. We just sit. Okay. Yeah. So one which is common, again, sometimes personal trainers do. Now one is where he can just come up, touch my hand, I'll push you, you'll resist halfway and come up. Okay, keep your hands like this together. Yeah, just come up and back, 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 without going down too much. Stop. Now, great looking exercise and is effective. If it's a very high level athlete, you can try that. You have to realize when I'm pushing, the amount of intra-abdominal pressure that he has to create, then he has to decelerate and come up. The deceleration is not just happening with his abdominals, that's also happening with his hip flexors. Okay, so and hip flexors too tight, especially load with speed and load, is a nightmare when it comes to lumbar region injuries. So this is one thing which can be done again for extremely high level athletes. A simpler way, okay, where you can sort of do plyos if you have to progress, okay, would be where you can add some variation to a plank. So if you can just get to the plank. So now here is in the plank, right? You can keep your knees up. Yeah. Now what can be done here? In a plank, as you can see, he just moves his hips high and back here. So one and up. So it's just this movement, 2, 3, 4. So you can see the abs from here, it's stretch, contract, okay. So again, stop. So it's like a rubber band, stretch, stretch, this is what. So you're preparing in a very safe manner. Elbows are down, his feet are down. So it's pretty safe, to do this, okay. So this becomes a much safer variation. It can help again for someone who wants to hit a smash, to go here and hit a smash. It can help somebody toss a ball, go back, quickly change direction. So this can help without the worries of the other one. Sometimes what I showed earlier, people can end up doing with a medicine ball. Somebody would be here and if you can just get back. Again, effective exercise, high risk, and you have to do it knowing that you can do it properly. Okay. So assume we'll just do an imaginary one. I'm not going to throw the medicine ball. So you come and you just throw and then I throw back, he catches, I throw. Okay. This is done. Now this again, if it's done, a lot of risk. Okay. Sometimes getting the ball back, sometimes throwing, a lot of issues come up. If he misses that ball, if it falls on his face, and these things happen, okay, can come up. These things happen where, a ball can come, miss, fall on his nose. There are examples, sometimes people have done this in swimming. Okay, and these are real world examples I can give you, where people throw the ball expecting the swimmer to catch, and then they are expected to throw it out, and imagine in swimming there's no ground to push off. Unlike other land-based sports, there's nothing. You're just here and you're exploding without anything. So it's much harder. You really have to have some good core stability and throw. So people have tried these, and in the water, they give the ball, coaches get excited, try to do some fancy moves to look good. So someone got this ball on the nose, okay, couldn't catch. Now, would that be important to do in such a situation where the swimmer is in the water, okay, and they cannot see, but then you are throwing the ball expecting them to catch when they are on an unstable surface? Is it worth the risk? That's a question you have to ask, okay. So you have to know if you want to do some movements just because they look good, or you want to do those movements because they are effective. And in all this comes safety first, okay. Moving to the next one, and probably the last exercise is push-ups. Now we all know push-ups are pretty effective, done. So if there's some upper body plyometrics, I'll show you a very simple version how you can do it, okay. Now normal push-up, you'd go down and up, right, down and up. So how can you add some plyometric sort of variation? You just come and you jump off, okay, from the bottom. So that can be one, okay. So if I'm here, okay, I go down and I come up, I just jump, I land. So like what we've done earlier, it's a dampened form. So first would be dampened is this, okay, down, up, I land, okay, I just absorb the shock. Again, I land, absorb the shock. Undampened would be where I go down, now you can see the impact is pretty high on the wrist. So if it's a person who's a racket sport player, you want to make sure that you don't injure them. What's the next? Some people can do clap push-ups, some people clap behind their hands. Most athletes won't, but the general, stunts that are done on social media. So you can see right now, my elbow sort of went down, my body went down all the way. So the highest form which we can say earlier, which places a lot of stress on the elbows, but again, which teaches you is not to take too much distance. So you go down, okay, just like what we did with the plyometrics for the legs, okay. Over there, we took the hip out at the end and we just did knee flexion. Same we've done here. First one we did, going down, absorbing the shock. I landed down. So that would be the progression for somebody who can at least do maybe close to 15 push-ups, okay. Then from there, the next progression becomes where they can do constant moves, okay. The third progression becomes where from there, they can just use the elbows without using the shoulder, okay. So these become the progression while training, okay. So there's sort of a linear pattern, but there's progression, and then there's also regression if need be. What happens if somebody is injured? Do you force them to do this ever? Never, okay. And plyometrics, like I've said earlier, there's various types of plyometrics. There's even for the biceps you can do with a medicine ball. You can just give me the medicine ball. Just to show something for the biceps which can be done. Again, simple, okay. It can still, the effect on the muscles is the same. You throw, catch, 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 catch. So this again, that impact on the hand when you're going down, okay, catching it, that itself can really give some amount of significant power development in your elbow flexors, okay. How much you do, when not to do, I mean, there's a lot of things, that come into play, okay. But hopefully this whole lecture has helped you understand how to put in plyometrics, power training, okay, to get the most out in a very basic manner, okay. This doesn't teach you a lot of high-level plyometrics which are there, and there's many high-level plyometric exercises which are there, okay. There's no end. There's like variations which are, out there. But what should happen now is when you look at an action, you should know which plane of motion it is. Is it dampened? Is it an advanced one? How many joints are working? So that is where you have to watch and observe. So that when you even take an exercise out from some exercise program that you see, okay, then you know which exercises to take, and you also know out of those exercises which one will help for which sport, okay. So whenever you see an exercise, I hope all this gives you clarity to note that when you see an exercise, you look at it like a medicine. You look at the movement, the joint patterns, the speed, and then you decide which exercise out of these would help me for which sport. You don't have to do everything out there for every sport. Okay? The whole idea behind this course is to make you better thinkers, to make you wiser, so that you have some basic understanding which helps you to pick the best from whichever videos you see, whichever books you see. There's so many books on strength and conditioning. There's so many videos out there. Okay? But the idea is to pick up everything that's best and then make it useful to you and your particular sport and your athlete. Thank you for this. Thank you, Varun, for this. Okay? I hope this lecture helps, and thank you for listening.